And welcome to the March 18, 2024 Committee of the Whole meeting. In compliance with the Open Meetings Act, which is posted in this room, we'll go ahead and get started with roll call. Madam Clerk?
Excuse me. Ellercone? Here. Barr?
Here.
Freshour? Hemer?
Here.
Jablonski?
Here.
Lopez? Here. Roth? Schilling?
Here.
Council President Jablonski, the roll has been called.
Okay. We have two items today. I've been posed with the question of which order we want to do this in. Obviously, the question was we design a master plan and then figure out how to pay for it. So I guess maybe that we should look at the master plan first and then look at the water rate second. But I guess that was an observation. If anybody has an objection to that.
Good afternoon, Council and Mayor. That's correct. We're going to review both plans, but we will do the master plan first, the CIP plan, and then we'll follow up with the rate study. We've got staff here from HDR.
Okay.
And they'll review the presentation.
Okay. The only way it was listed 2 and 3.
Right. And that's, I asked for clarification when we got here, which we're going to do first, so.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, so we have the water master plan. And who would like to speak to us?
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Koenig with HDR. Address is 1917 South 67th Street, Omaha, Nebraska. And so today we'll talk about the water master plan. I think and again, it's kind of our agenda that we're going to go through today. It's, kind of walk through what the purpose of the master plan is, demand projections, system evaluation, as well as the treatment evaluation, and then finally the recommended improvements. So the purpose of the master plan is to essentially come up with a plan for moving the city forward. The first step is to go through a very detailed analysis of the city's water system, both the treatment, distribution, supply, and so that way we know what we have before we move forward. And then we're also looking at, again, we're tying this to the council on the Columbus Envision 2040 plan. And so that was kind of our target year, so that's where we want to end up with. So at 2040, your water system supports what is currently planned. Then we have to develop plans for how we're going to meet those demand projections. Then finally, we want to come up with an implementable, prioritized, and adaptable CIP. It's very, very critical that the city has a plan to go forward, and they understand what needs to be done, and then they can also, and that feeds into the rate study of how they're going to pay for it. So this is our detailed scope, kind of a brief detailed scope of what we, the basis of it. So this we'll talk through is the demand projections, the system evaluation. The demand projections are based, again, on the 2040 envision. The hydraulic model is one that we went into very detailed on, where we brought in all the GIS from the existing system and also all the down to the detail of the water usage by customer, and that also got brought into the system to make sure we had that right. And now we have a good model for the city, and that's going to be able to move that forward, and then we can model the proposed improvements with the system to meet the 2040 demands. Treatment evaluations, again, we'll talk about that in more detail with the water treatment options, and then well field expansion, and then also clear well requirements. And finally, we'll wrap it up again with the CIP recommendations. So with respect to the demand projections, essentially the city of Columbus has had pretty steady growth since 1960. And so it's roughly just under 1% growth. And that's what we've used it as our basis for it. It's a little bit on the conservative side, but that's what our growth is. And so currently, in 2020, the city's population was a little over 24,000, and based on a 1% growth rate, it ends up to be 29,300. And that feeds into what we're going to talk, the demands that's going to be on the water system and how that moves forward. So this is just graphically, it shows, just got it plotted out. You can see it's got a nice, steady graph.
Was any sensitivity analysis done on the growth rate? Did you go through and look at 0.5% or 1.5% growth rate to see how it might affect overall demand and overall plan?
That's a great question. We often will look at sensitivity on population. For a 0.5% growth rate, that would be more like the 2030. So the 2030 model would be half of that growth. So that would be equivalent to
Excuse me,
like,
can we get you to identify yourself and talk?
Hello, my name is Derek Gardells. I have the same address or work at the same place as Chris Koenig. To answer your question, we didn't specifically look at higher growth rates. We looked at the 1% as being a conservative growth rate based on what we've seen historically. And we revised that growth rate up based on what the 2020 census were actual versus what the previous projection was. So we felt like the 1% was a pretty conservative on the top end. Looking at a smaller growth rate for 2040, that would look very similar to what we showed for the 2030 population projection. So if it grows at a 0.5% a year, then you would be closer to what that 2030 population was. But we didn't specifically look at a much higher growth rate, but that's something that could very easily be done as part of the models that have already been developed. So that would not be a difficult thing to do.
So kind of a brief overview of what the Columbus water system is. That on the north side you have 5 wells that are feed into the North Water Treatment Plant, and then the water from that the wells flows to the treatment plant, and they add the chemicals, and then it goes into the reservoir. And there's a ground storage reservoir that's 3 million gallons, and at the top elevation of that sets the water surface for the city, and so then it flows down into the distribution system. There's also a small booster pump there's a booster station that feeds the Central Community College. That's a separate pressure zone. And on the south side, there's 7 wells that feed into the treatment plant. Now, on the south treatment plant, once it goes through treatment, it flows into a clear well. And there's a high service pump station, and that pushes the water up into the elevated storage tank that's on the south side of town, and also into the distribution system. Now, the Balin Tower is also part of the system. Unfortunately, that tower is too short, and it actually does not provide enough. It really doesn't have any much uses for your operational storage or for fire flow, just due to the height. The distribution system is all on one pressure zone, with the exception of the Central Community College. So as I said before, we developed a very detailed hydraulic model for the system. There's 180 miles of water main in the city, and so we went through and modeled everything, every service connection, every valve, every hydrant, and so that way we have everything very detailed down. And also then what we did is we validated the model, and so the city had a fire flow test, and so they'd provide the results of the fire flow test and what the pressure was and what pressure and flows are, and then we'd compare that to what the model was showing, and then we'd tweak it as we need to, because as water mains grow old over time, their capacity grows a little bit less, and so it's always a little bit of a judgment on what the exact actual flow rate is going to be, and so we were able to get it real close. And the second part of that then is once we had the model, so we know what we have today, then we look at whether water use projections are going to be, but also looking at, again, the Envision 2040 plan, because we looked at where the growth is anticipated for the city. And then we evaluated, like I said, the midterm, which is the 2025, I'm sorry, near term 2025, 2030, and then 2040, looking at the pressures, velocity, and fire flows. So again, here's the Columbus Envision 2040 on where the anticipated growth was. And so the projected growth that we had anticipated, that's laid on based on these requirements. So based on our growth projection, again, using the 1% growth rate, you can see how right now existing average day demand, which is, average day demand is if you take all your water for an entire year divided by 365, that's your number. Maximum day demand is that one day out of the year where you have your highest peak, and then that way you can compare them, because you have to meet the peak demand plus fire flow. Now, the interesting thing with Columbus is that there's a high number of industry use. And so typically your average data demand, your maximum data demand is 3 to 4 times higher than your average data demand. But with Columbus, it's very steady at just under 2%, 2 times. So that indicates that, you have a strong industry base, and so you don't see the big peaks that you normally see in a system. And so the maximum data demand right now is 12.1, and based on 1% growth rate, that's going to be 14.8 in the future. And that's what we're targeting as what we need to meet for our supply and treatment demands. So again, this is just a linear progression as far as that 1% growth. Now we walk through the results. And so what we're looking at now is if there's no improvements to your water system, and we have growth, that 1% growth through 2040. This is what the pressure zones look like. Now the yellow zone is the ideal, where that's 40 to 50 psi, and so that's a really good range for your users. The orange, that indicates 20 to 40 psi, and so that means it's starting to drop on that western side of town. Again, the western side of the ground, the ground's higher, so your pressure drops, and so that's where it's showing that there's some problems in that area. The red dots up along Lake Babcock, those are just within that distribution system, so not really too concerned with those. But you could see that on the west side, it does become a little bit problematic. Then the velocity, what's really interesting was even with the 2040, with the fire flow demands, there wasn't really a lot of locations where we had high velocity. There's a couple red notes right in the center, just below Highway 30, but not a whole lot. So again, the system, Public Works has been doing a really good job of maintaining the system and addressing sizing issues over the years, and so that shows a very solid system. But then this one is the fire flow. And so this is looking at if you have max data demand and then you have a fire at the same time. And you can see there's a lot of orange and some red. And what that indicates is that your fire flow for the reds, that means you have less than 500 gallons a minute to be able to fight a fire, which becomes very concerning. The ideal, again, is going to be about over 1,000 gallons a minute for fire protection.
Like Wagner's Lakes, it's a trouble spot.
So what we did then was once we knew what the problems were, then we developed our recommendation, modeled some different scenarios to bring it so you can meet the projected 2040 demands. And so the red lines are new lines that are being proposed, with the exception of that one that's on 17th Street. That's where a main replacement along 17th that goes, we go from a 6-inch and upsize it up to a 12 and have improved water flow through that area. But most of them is just adding additional piping in for looping. Then it also includes the proposed elevated storage tank on the west side of town, which I'll talk about in a minute. But if we put all those in place, we end up with where we want to be for 2040, where all the pressures in 2040 all fall within the desired range. So our next step was to look at the storage and pump stations. Now, storage volume is dictated by the 3 components: operational, fire flow, and reserve. So operational is during normal operating days, the water level in the tank goes up and down as people use water. Fire flow is you have to assume that you're going to have the potential that you might have the water drawn down your tank during heavy usage, and then a fire starts, and so you have to have that additional capacity in place for fire flow. And then reserve is just having that cushion in there because the worst case scenario, you have a fire going and a power outage, and so, or whatever. There's a lot of things that can happen, and we want to make sure that there's a little bit extra storage in there. So we're looking at, you have the south elevated tower, the north ground storage reservoir that we talked about. We did not, in our evaluation, we did not include the Balin Tower. And again, we looked at the different 25, 30, and 45 for our terms. And we looked at two scenarios for the storage. The first one, I guess one of the key components is that north ground storage reservoir. It's a 3 million gallon tank, but you're only able to use the top 6.3 feet of it. Because what happens if you drop below that level, then there's pressure problems. The pressure's downstream below 20 psi. And so you're not able to use that full 3 million gallons in that reservoir. And so what we looked at is if we, looking at the current deficit right now, that's what showing the current deficit right now is 0.9 million gallons. And so, again, the south tower is 2 million gallons, north reservoir, the effective storage is only 0.42 that's usable. And so we have a 2.42, but again, that's where you see the deficits. So by 2040, the deficit is 1.7 million gallons. Now, the second option that we looked at was when we add treatment to the north end, on the north treatment plant, we're looking at adding treatment to address manganese, is that the treatment actually knocks down the hydraulics in the system, and so you don't have as much water flowing from the wells into that ground storage reservoir, just because it uses hydraulics going through the treatment system. And so we're already looking at adding in a high service pump station. Now what that high service pump station would do is would use the ground storage reservoir as a clear well. And so it would pull from that and then pump out into the distribution system and to the new elevated storage tank. And when we run that scenario, what we could do then is that 3 million gallon reservoir at the north end, we can use that for fire protection. Because you got 3 million gallons, it's all there, and we can start using that reservoir more effectively. And so with that, then that knocks down your surplus, or your deficit, in the year 2040 down to 1.2. So you got a lot more cushion to move as you move forward.
Is there ever any thought to increasing the volume of a current storage? I mean, like with the Balin Tower, you're not including it because it's not big enough. Could you expand it? Does it maybe it doesn't fit into what all this, I'm just asking, you got?
I'm not ever, I've heard of towers being taken down and put back up, but I'm not ever sure about raising a tower.
Putting another level on like a grain bin or something.
Yeah, I've never seen that before, but that's something we could look into. So what we're looking at is, again, what we're recommending is a new elevated water storage tower on the west side of town. And again, then with that new high service pump station at the North Treatment Plant, and then that makes that north ground storage reservoir a clear well and improves the turnover in that tank, but also then reduces the amount of storage that's required in the year 2040. And there actually there's a real good location for that over off Lost Creek Parkway. There's a brand new main that's getting put into service pretty quickly here. They'll be able to serve that tank, and so it does work out very well as far as the hydraulics. The pump stations right now, again, we looked at mostly was just the ones at the South Treatment Plant. There's a pump station there. There's the pump station that serves the Central Community College, but that's just an isolated one-off. It doesn't feed back into the rest of the system. And so we looked at different options. Again, with the North Treatment Plant, once we add treatment, we are going to have to add a high service pump station. And so that's where kind of I talked through a lot of this already, but essentially right now is that right now there's in excess of 0.8 million gallons capacity because that high service pump station in the south end, it does very well. But when we get to 2030, you can see that we're already starting to have a little bit of a deficit, and by 2040, we're looking at a deficit of just under 2 million gallons a day that needs to be addressed. So again, for this several times, but the recommendation is to add a high service pump station at the North Treatment Plant and pull that water from that ground storage reservoir and use that as a clear well. So then the next we looked at the water treatment, the well field, and an additional clear well for the south treatment plant. So with the right now the water in Columbus is very high in iron and manganese, and so manganese is a secondary contaminant, which means that it doesn't pose a health risk, but it does create some other issues. Number one, mostly it's aesthetics with taste, odor, color, and things like that. So it's not one that the EPA has set a limit that has to be treated and removed at this time, but it's just more just aesthetics. And the recommended level of manganese within the system is about 1 million gallon, 1.1 milligram per liter. Sorry about that. Right now, at well number 19, the manganese level in there, and this is the worst case scenario, is 4.45 milligrams per liter. The current process that the city is using is sequestering the manganese, and so what they add is using polyphosphate. So the polyphosphate binds with the manganese and keeps it in suspension, and so it passes through the system without causing a whole lot of issues. Now, the EPA recommended level for using sequestering is 0.1 milligrams per liter. Unfortunately, the raw water at the South Treatment Plant, the average is 0.57, and with a maximum of 0.69. So it's already getting to the point where that sequestering doesn't work, and something has to be done. So we looked at different treatment options, and the one we felt was the most cost-effective and effective for the city was manganese green sand filtration. And so it's a package plant that's delivered to the site, but essentially it's a filtering operation, as you can see in the diagram there, where the water comes in and it goes to the filter. The sand is coated with this magnesium oxide, which gives it the green tint. Hence the green sand filtration. But the manganese oxide binds with the manganese in the water and makes it insoluble, and so then that pulls it out of the system, and then we remove the manganese from the finished water, and thus improving the water quality. And then they backflush the manganese and goes into the sewer system. So with the South Treatment Plant, there's an existing building that's in place, and so this is a schematic of how it could be piped. Again, it's a package unit becoming as one unit, and we'd be able to have 3 of those at the South Plant. The North Treatment Plant, there's not a building in place, and so we're looking at building a new building with all the controls and everything else that would also tie into that. Again, looking at a different number of units there and smaller units. So for the North Wellfield improvements, again, right now there is actually a little bit of deficit as far as the supply for the water supply, and so we're recommending 2 1,500-gallon-a-minute wells. Now, there's an existing well field. That's what's outlined in red. That's the existing well field. There is room right now for a new well that could be installed. The second well would have to be at a new location. There's not enough room in the existing well field just due to the proximity to other wells and other systems in the area. So the new one would have to be located off-site. So the first one, we're recommending that would be the first project out of the gate, is to install that new well installed. And the second one would have to be in place for the projected 2030 demands. And then that new well would be located to the west of the existing well field. Because what the city has found is as you go east, the manganese levels increase. And so the well number 19 is the far east well that causes a problem. It's a South Treatment Plant. Again, the water from the wells flows into a clear well, and then the high service pumps pull out of that and pump that into the distribution system. There's only one clear well, and so it cannot be taken out of service. And it also is a little bit too small for the system as it sits right now. So what the recommendation is install a new one. We're not aware that'd be installed next to it. Now, we looked at different options in that area, north of 10th Street, west of 28th. And this is the recommended location, is immediately to the west of the existing clear well. And it would be piped, it would be built and operated in parallel. And so what that means is that the high service pumps could either pump from both clear wells, or it could pull from one or the other. And so that existing clear well could be taken out of service for service and maintenance as needed. So where we're at with, so for the raw water and treatment recommendations is we're recommending green sand filtration at both treatment plants. Recommending based on the one for the south is having that online in 2027, and the north in 2032. Two additional 1,500 gallon minute wells. One would be on site and the other one would be to the west. And then a new 1 million gallon clear well at the south treatment plant.
Did you say that we had more issues with the north well?
There's the one well that's problematic, that well number 19, where it's very high in manganese, and so it's not used very often. But actually, the manganese levels in the south, within the south well field, are higher than in the north overall.
Okay.
And so that's why we're recommending going with the south first. Okay. So then what we did is we took all of our findings and recommendations and rolled this into the prioritized CIP. And again, this is our best guess as far as the timing of the projects, and it can vary. If there's a new development comes into town and new transmission mains need to be installed, or else if things really taper off and the growth doesn't occur as projected, these can be adjusted up and down. But based on the assumptions we made as far as the growth rate for the city and using the 2040 Envision plan, this is what we're looking at. And so this is through the year 2034. Again, the first one would be the new well, and then start working on the green sand filter for the south treatment plant, and add the second well, and so on and so forth. Now the transmission main projects we have down the list, but those are a little bit floaters, and it's going to come to if there's new industry or a new development comes into town, or the city starts seeing a problem with fire flow in a specific area, then they can go ahead and move those up the list as they need to. So there's a little bit of flexibility on those.
How have you cost those items that far out?
This is all based on today's dollar, and so and Sean will get into the details as far as the projections for the escalating the prices going forward and looking at the water rate study. And so this is the last series of projects. Again, the nuclear well and some more of the transmission main projects. Oops. And with that, I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Any questions, council members? Yeah.
When we're digging a new well.
Okay. Next.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Sean Korn, HDR Engineering. After you have the overall capital plan, then we can roll that into our rate study. So this afternoon, what I'll do is walk you through the overall review of the rate study, what that entails, how we go through the process. We'll talk about the 3 steps of a cost of service study, which is a revenue requirement, cost of service, and rate design. The result of those providing you with cost-based and proportional rates for your different customer classes of service, so residential, industrial, as we start thinking about how each of those different customer types are served, and then answer any questions that you all may have. So kicking off with what a rate study is, really as we go into this, we think about what is our goal or outcome as we develop the analysis. And the first one really is coming back and developing a sufficient projection of revenues to adequately support the operating and capital needs of the water and sewer utilities. Now, this is independently calculated. Water is water, sewer is sewer. So when we think about the projects that Chris just walked you all through, those are all on the water side. So we have that master plan, CIP, capital improvement plan, that plays into our water rate study. On the sewer side or the wastewater side, we have the current city plan that was built for the analysis. One of the other outcomes, as I've alluded to, is our cost-based and proportional rates. So thinking about what is that adequate level of supporting our operating and capital needs through rates, and then ultimately, how does that impact the rate schedules or how we charge the different customers that you all have. As we go through this, we think about our different financial planning criteria, so that includes things such as adequately funding our capital improvements. So water, pretty basic. Chris just walked you through some of those bigger projects that we need to think about. But we also need to think about how are we funding those projects. So are we funding those through rates or on a pay-as-you-go basis? Are we using existing reserves? If so, what are the minimum target levels for reserves that we need to maintain for a prudently run utility? And meet any required debt service coverage requirements or ratios. So just like when we go out in our personal lives and borrow for a house or a car, there's the credit check. On the utility side, there are certain revenue projections that need to be met, and that's typically referred to as a debt service coverage requirement. To develop the analysis, we base this on generally accepted methodologies and approaches. There's two manuals out there, one by the American Water Works Association, one by the Water Environment Federation, that lay out the process, the revenue requirement, cost, service, and rate design, that we then follow. But this is based specifically on your system, operations, your customer characteristics. So the three-step process is sequential. So as we go through this, our revenue requirement defines what our operating and capital expenses are and how we're funding those. Once we know the overall revenue needs or adjustment to rates to fund those revenue needs, then we go through the cost of service. Now, we have to develop a cost of service because we serve different types of customer. Chris talked a little bit about this on our average day versus our peak day. When you think about how we use water over a course of a year in our single-family homes, right? We have low use in the winter, and then we peak in the summers. We're watering the lawn, washing the cars, spraying the driveway down, whatever we may be doing, and then it drops off in the fall and winter, and we have lower. So that is that peak that he's talking about that we need to develop the system around. And from a cost of service perspective, we allocate costs based on who's driving that peak. Industrial, as an example, has a very flat peak. They use the same amount of water 365 days a year for the most part. So they don't have that summer inflection necessarily. They're a flatter use, which means they have different system requirements. That's the purpose of our cost of service, is to think about what does it cost to serve each customer class to make sure we're charging them an appropriate rate based on our overall system revenue needs. Once we know the answer to those first two, then we can dive into the rate design, and that's how you charge your customer, through that monthly fixed charge and through that consumption or volume charge for water or sewer. So as we go through the analysis, a couple of the key issues we looked at is the adequately funding our annual operating costs. This goes for both utilities. Thinking about how costs have been increasing annually from inflation. So we've all seen this at the grocery store, the gas station, everywhere else, the costs going up. The same thing happens to the utilities. Electricity costs have increased, chemical costs have increased, that we need to capture as part of this, while also maintaining our financial metrics. We also want to think about those capital needs. Chris just walked you through the water capital, some fairly extensive projects that you'll see how they impact the water rates. On the sewer side, based on the plans in place today, we have adequate revenue for a pay-as-you-go approach. So we're funding our capital needs through our current rates and reserves going forward. So jumping into our revenue requirement, again, really what this revenue requirement does is looks at our operating and capital needs, and then determines that level of rate revenue adjustment necessary to support that operating capital. Again, based on how we fund our annual capital plans, how we've developed or determined the amount of renewal and replacement needs, maintaining target ending reserve balances. We generally look over a long-term period, so we're looking at over 10 years. The rates and information you'll see here, we'll have some charts with all 10 years. We'll have the focus of the rates is over the next 5 years as we start thinking about what those needs are. And we do that for two reasons. One, we do want to think long-term. We want to see what's coming around the corner so we can start planning for that, so we don't have significant rate increases in the future as we go through this process. But we have a better feel for what's happening in the next 5 years than maybe we do the next 5 years, years 6 through 10. So this gives you the opportunity, as Chris mentioned, as things change, growth may change, it may speed up, it may slow down. It gives you a chance to adjust your rates over time as you go through this. Both utilities are evaluated on a standalone basis. So I mentioned water is water, sewer is sewer. Our water revenues stay and pay for water expenses. Our sewer revenues stay and pay for sewer expenses. And we're not transferring in any funds from other city funds, the general fund or other funds, to pay for water or sewer expenses. We do use what's known as the cash basis methodology. For any accountants in the room or going back and looking at this is just looking at it for each annual year. What are our needs in this year versus the next year, and how do we fund these over time? Some of our key assumptions as we go through the revenue requirement, we independently calculate the revenues, and we do this for a couple reasons. One is it's our first check in the model. Do the units and customers that we have in the utility tie to the revenues you've actually been receiving? So it's our first check of say, okay, you collect this amount of revenue, we don't have the billing units, because those are important for developing the final proposed rates, making sure we have the right amount of customers, meter size, amount of billed consumption. So that's based on your current adopted rates, so the rates that are in place today for each utility, and the last year of customer data. Our O&M expenses are based on our 2023 adopted budget, and then we project that out through the 10-year period based on average inflationary impacts going forward. And then on the water side, just the side note here, with some of those projects that Chris was talking about, we have some minor additional O&M for the additional pumping. So additional chemicals and electricity, and as an example, for those green sand filter projects for both the south and the north sites as part of that. So as we think about our overall capital, this is the water capital funding analysis. This is our smooth rate alternative. So you'll see later on we have two alternatives. One is annual equal adjustments for the next 5 years. The other option is higher increases in the first 3 years, followed by lower increases in the out years, and I'll walk you through some of that. But this shows you your annual capital needs based on that last table that Chris showed you. So starting in 2023 and 2024, you'll see the bars are the annual capital needs. So the big spike in 2031 is looking out in those out years where we had the green sand filter. The green, or the bottom part of each of these charts, is our rate funded capital. That's the annual amount of reinvestment through rates. Now, one of our targets here is to at least fund annual depreciation expense, so that we're reinvesting in the system as it's depleting from an accounting perspective. Now, the challenge is that reflects assets that may have been put in the ground 50, 60, 80 years ago. And the cost to replace those today are much more than that original cost and that depreciation. So we're trying to ratchet that up, that green, that's why you see that increase, to reflect those overall targets. The blue, the second part of the chart, is our use of reserves. So using existing reserves that the water utility has in place to pay for capital projects. And then the red, or the big spikes, that is our annual debt service. So we're issuing debt to fund projects. So that first issue in 2026 would then be used in the subsequent year. So you see the blue coming out. And then we issue debt in 29 and we use it, and we issue debt in 31 and we use most of that there, and then some in 32. So we're looking at long-term borrowing. We've assumed a worst-case scenario with the assumed terms, so interest and term. So but there are opportunities as well as part of that when you go through the process for the state low-interest loan program, the sort of revolving fund loan types of programs that will be able to impact this. But ultimately, this provides our funding approach. So as we think about this, looking at our rate-funded capital, that's going to provide us with that annual need. So we do have a rate impact as that increases. The use of reserve is simply maintaining our target minimums, and I'll show you a slide here in a moment with our reserve balances on how this impacts water. And then with the debt, if we issue debt, we have an annual payment that we have to fund each year. So just like with our car payment or mortgage, we have to pay this off over a certain amount of time. So when we issue debt, that comes back in as a cost that we would need to fund as well. Now, just for comparison's sake, when I talked about the two alternatives, one was an annual adjustment of the same amount running at 9.5%. The second option was 3 years at 15%, followed by 6% annual adjustments. That's this scenario, the secondary scenario. The difference is the amount of debt that we would have to issue. With those higher upfront increases, then we're able to reduce the amount of debt that we issue to fund those projects. However, it is only $3.5 million that we knock off with those different adjustments. And I'll show you what those rates look like here in a moment as well. When we think of our water revenue requirement, again, it's the sum of our total annual expenses. So the bottom part of this chart, our black or gray part, is our total O&M expenses. You see that increasing over time for inflation, as well as some additional power and chemical needs as those green sand filter projects come online. The red is our net debt service. So you see we have some existing debt, and then that steps up as we go out into the future. With the issuances that we have. The green is our rate funded capital, and then the blue is our reserve funding. So that's funds going into reserves that we ultimately used on the prior slide to fund our capital improvement projects. So the horizontal, or essentially horizontal line going across the screen right about through the middle of the green as we get out into the long term, that is our current revenues at today's rates. So what that's saying is we're bringing in about just under $4.5 million on average. That goes up slightly with that 1% customer growth that Chris spoke about earlier. Where our revenues need to go is to the top of each of those bars to fund our overall expenses. So that delta between the horizontal solid black line and the dashed black line is our annual rate adjustment that we need to recover. Now, how does this impact our reserve levels? As I mentioned, we're using reserves to fund capital projects. We're also putting funds to reserves to fund future capital. This gives you a 10-year look at our overall ending reserve balances. Now, there's two components to this. One is the minimum target of 90 days of annual O&M. So thinking about just our annual O&M basic costs, we keep 90 days of that in reserve, plus 1 year of our annual capital needs, less the debt financed capital. So what we're looking at here really is 90 days of O&M plus our average capital, typical capital that we use. That's the dashed line, that's our target. Now you see the peaks in 26, 29, and 31. That's when we're issuing debt, so those funds come into our reserves, and then we use those in subsequent years. So we're using reserves, and then we come down to our target levels over the 10-year period as we go out through this rate plan. This is with the proposed rate adjustments built into the analysis. So that's the water side. Go ahead.
I was just clarifying in our packet, the last three slides, I don't think we have those. I'm not seeing them. So I just, if you don't mind switching back one more, I just wanted to look at it. Okay. Yeah. It's not the same.
Oh, it's not the same.
It's not. And the one prior isn't either. That's not the same.
That's not the updated one.
So I just wanted time to look at that. I was
If you
trying
got-
to
if you-
process that as you were saying. Sorry,
That's okay,
I'm a
it's all good.
crock-pot thinker. I apologize.
If
So it
you've
takes me a
updated it, we
moment.
didn't get the update.
So I just wanted to say, I was more looking at that debt. So can you, I apologize, but can you restate that to me one more time when I'm looking at that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So when we think about how we're funding our capital improvement plan, we're balancing a couple components. So we're looking at the bottom green, which is our annual rate funded capital. So
Yep.
trying to reinvest in the system at an adequate level, which also has an impact directly on rates, right? So if we're paying with rate revenue and we're increasing that, we have an impact to rates. So we're balancing that with the use of reserves, which we're trying to maintain our minimum levels over the long term, which is our blue piece. So to meet the difference, we're issuing debt in those 3 years. So that's the red peaks that you see where we're issuing debt. Now, not all of that is always being used in that year. We may actually spread that out and use it over the next 1 or 2 years as part of that, because that's how we would issue debt, right? Is we would go out and borrow, $5 million. We're not gonna borrow $1 million and then the next year we borrow $2 million. Now, you may get that with
Right.
specific programs or grants, but in general, for a rate study, we're looking at the broader, bigger picture here as part of that. So these three are kind of coincide with the table that Chris showed right at the end with kind of our peak year of capital and how we would fund those different projects.
Okay, thank you.
One more question.
Absolutely.
Is that funding or the debt on today's dollar amount, or is that projected?
It's at the projected cost in those years.
Okay.
So again, that could go up or down, right, as we get out 3, 4, 5 years as part of that. But that's based on that projected cost in the out years.
But does that correlate with the projected costs of what we need to do?
Yes.
You said that was in today's dollars.
So the rate study looks at what that cost is in the future. So we've escalated those costs.
So, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Trying to capture what that may look like.
Basically, you're taking into account inflation
Yes.
as best you can.
Okay.
Correct.
That's the question.
That is a good statement.
That's the question.
Yes.
And tell me again why the big peak on 2031?
So that is the North Plant Green Sand Filter Project. That is one where Chris was talking about. There's no building there.
Right here.
So that's got a little more cost associated to that with it being a bigger project than the South Plant side.
Okay,
And that rolls into these charts.
yeah, that's,
Just I'll walk kind of through this since we're tying it all together. Remember, as we look at our O&M expenses, our debt service then, right, if we issue debt, we need to pay that back. So that's why the red or the middle bar is getting bigger. And then we have our green rate funded capital and we have our blue for our reserve funding. So that's kind of an in and out balancing that. And then that all gets balanced, so we've got kind of three moving pieces here for this with our reserves. So as we issue debt, it comes back into our capital reserve. We use it, we issue more debt, and then you can see our goal here. We're a little low in 2032, but our goal is to kind of hit our target as we get out through year 10. Same approach on the sewer side. So on the sewer side, we're looking at our capital needs. We have a couple large projects in this current year and next year as we go into this. Those are reserve funded or mostly reserve funding. The blue is our use of reserves. The green is our rate funded capital. So again, you can see that is increasing in each year to reflect an adequate level of renewal and replacement in the system, but maintaining that overall funding at about $3 million as we get out there in year 6. Now, slightly different picture on the wastewater side. When we look at this again, our revenue requirement sums our annual O&M. That's the gray component. Some existing debt service that you have, which is the red. Our rate funded capital, which is the green. And then our blue, which is some minor reserve funding. Now, again, the solid black horizontal line, current revenues at current rates. So with our current customer base, plus 1% growth. And then to bump that up, it's a much smaller gap. This is running at about 3% a year, which happens to be roughly our inflation assumption going out in the out years. So on the sewer side, looking at the revenues today versus expenses, we're adequately meeting our targets. So we have what you would say is a balanced budget on the water side, on the sewer side. As you go out, we do need to increase that to account for both inflation and O&M. Plus increasing rate-funded capital as we go into the future as part of that. Reserves are sitting right about our target, same minimum target, 90 days of O&M plus 1 year of CIP. This would be the same, less any debt funded, but we don't have any debt funded or financed projects on the sewer side of this. One note on the 90 days, that's kind of on the bottom third of the target list of what your minimum would be. You go to some of the bond markets or the financial markets, there are agents, or there are going out and looking at wanting you to have 180 days or 365 days. So 6 months of O&M to a year of O&M on hand. Again, that's total cash, so when we look at this, when we're looking at 90 days plus 1 year of CIP, we're running right about those nice targets overall as a total combined operating and capital. So once we know the overall cost, the top of each of those bars for our revenue requirement, we can go into our cost of service. Now, when we think about our cost of service on the water side, we're looking at our average annual consumption. So how much water does each customer type use? And we're looking at residential, commercial, and industrial categories. And how is their peak consumption impacting the system? So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, the different peaking on the system drives the sizing. So those that drive the cost or the peak should pay for their proportional share of those costs. So that's what we're looking at. So as an example, if single-family customers used 50% of the water on the system, they would be allocated or distributed 50% of the average day costs. Now, that may vary when we start looking at peaking or capacity. Because residential customers make up a higher peak on the system, they could have a greater proportional share of the peak cost. Whereas industrial may have a lower proportional share because they don't peak the system. Now, that's where you get the difference in your rate. So if you look at your rate schedules right now, we have a fixed charge for everybody by meter size, and then we have different consumption charges for residential, commercial, and industrial. That's reflecting their peak use on the system. So we went through and developed a cost of service analysis. There are some cost differences in here. I will say this is the first cost of service completed in some time, where we're looking at the distribution of cost between customer classes. Again, residential, commercial, and industrial. So at this point, we're recommending an across-the-board adjustment. So rates would be adjusted equally for everybody going forward. On the sewer side, similar discussion. It's based on average wastewater volume, so what's being discharged and treated at the plant, and the strength of that wastewater. Higher the strength, harder it is, and more costly it is to treat the wastewater that's coming to the plant. Not something we usually think about, but there are additional costs depending on what's coming down the pipe. We did the same process for thinking about our residential, commercial, industrial. There were minimal differences here on the sewer cost of service. The rates are looking really tight as far as cost of service goes. Part of that is because when we get to the rate, you'll see you have a high strength surcharge component, which actually captures those customers that are impacting the system on a greater level. So again, given this is one of the first cost of service studies done in some time, we're recommending across the board. So now we know how much to collect. We know who to collect it from, in this case, equally among all customers. And so then we looked at the overall rate structure and how we charge it. For what we're recommending right now is we maintain that current rate structure for both utilities. That includes that service charge or monthly fixed charge that varies by meter size, plus a flat fee per 1,000 gallons, the usage charge for all customers. Now, you also do have an outside city rate, so those customers that are outside of the city, they're charged a differential. We've maintained that differential as part of our rate development. It's a fairly common process that utilities, cities use as part of their rate setting process. I'm actually part of a group that's reviewing outside city rates for another agency as we go through this. So as I mentioned, we had two alternatives for water. The first is our smooth assumption. That's equal adjustments across all rate components for all customers. That was 9.5% per year for each of the 5 years. Scenario 2, the upfront rate increase. Again, everybody increasing the same, each rate component increasing the same, but it's 15% for the first 3 years, 6% for the subsequent years. And on sewer, it's an across-the-board adjustment, so 3% evenly on everything. Now, one of the questions you may be wondering is, well, why does sewer look so great and water's not looking so great? Well, there's a couple things going on. One of them is sewer was in this situation about 10, 12 years ago, where you had some fairly significant capital improvement needs on the sewer side that you issued the existing long-term debt from, that you also funded on a pay-as-you-go basis. And so you can see on the slide what those adjustments look like. We had somewhere in the neighborhood of 15% for a couple of years, a handful of years at 10%, and leveled out at about 5%. So that was funding those sewer capital improvement needs that were identified. And as part of that, you've set the stage for why sewer is looking okay. We're looking at inflationary adjustments now going forward to fund those capital projects. The water system is now in the same place that the sewer system was 10 years ago. Chris just talked about that master plan, those capital needs, those improvements that are necessary to maintain and grow the system to meet your customers' demands. And here's kind of that annual water rate adjustment over the last 10 years, where rates really have not changed on the water side. So that also plays a part of this, right? As we think about what the inflation has been in the last 10 years, just even ignoring the last couple of years that we saw, we would have that inflation impact going forward. So as we think about that, it's how do we fund that existing capital plan, those impacts of inflation on the water side, the manganese treatment, storage and transmission improvements and new wells, and the timing of those as we start out through 2026 and beyond. Maintaining our adequate reserves for cash flow requirements, emergencies, and if debt is issued, that is one of the requirements that the lending agencies will look at, is how much cash or reserves do you have, and maintaining the financial metrics. So as an example, what that overall adjustment between the two scenarios are, the top part, smooth, is the 9.5% per year, then the upfront with 15, 15, 6, 6. Those numbers below are the average customer bill, so that's your typical 3/4 inch meter with 10,000 gallons, so typical single-family home on an annual basis. You can see the bill today would be $20.28, and then how that increases each year. Now, that's the monthly increase per year. So those are not the numbers at the bottom, the $1.93 and the smooth, the $2.11, the $2.31, those are the annual increases. Those are not the cumulative increases. The sum of those would be the cumulative increase over the 5-year period. So taking that to what the rates look like, again, you see the percentages across the top, increasing that service charge. Again, the bulk of your residential customers are in that 3/4 inch meter size. Your commercials start getting down into the larger meter sizes up to those 2-3 inch. Your industrial are up on the bottom end of that as we go forward with larger meters. And then this is the single family consumption charge. You can see that increase from $1.35 to $1.48 and so on. And then the outside rate, which has that outside differential. Same thing with alternative 2. The comparison here, I just kind of look at 2028. We end the fixed charge at $11.59 and the inside city consumption charge at $2.31. Under the smooth, we're at $10.67 and $2.13. So you can kind of see that savings. And then we have a slide here where you can compare those. This is the first year, our first year adjustment, but ultimately, at zero use, 2,000 gallons, and so on through 12,000 gallons. The impact to customers with that 9.5 versus 15%, is a couple dollars difference, which really you can see here. We go from in 24 $1.93 versus $3.04, $2.11 in 2025 versus $3.50, and so on as we go out through time. Just as a comparison, this is not how we set rates. We don't look at our neighbors and say, well, this is great, they're here, but it is always a question we have, or we receive as we go through this. So we grabbed a handful here. Going across the chart, you'll see our present City of Columbus at 5,000 gallons and 10,000 gallons, present and proposed. You'll see the average is the third set of bars there, and then you'll see Kearney, Papillion, North Platte, Hastings, Fremont, et cetera, as we go through that, and you can see kind of how you compare. Overall, just from a pure comparison, looking at an average bill, fairly reasonable, fairly similar to the other agencies as part of this. Again, we don't know where some of these are in their process. They may be going through a rate adjustment like this or evaluating this. They may have just done it. So again, timing is everything here. On the sewer side, here's our 3% a year, the current sewer bill, $35, and that increases just over $1 per month per year at that 3% annual adjustment. And again, what those rates look like, The service charge by meter size, as well as the consumption charge for inside and outside. And then on the bottom of this slide, you can see those strength sewer surcharge rates. So those are charged per pound of BOD, TSS, or grease. That's the measurement that's used. And you can see those are for those those customers that discharge higher strength into the system. They're billed for that additional strength. So that's one reason why sewer looks nice and neat, is you have charges like this. This is something I recommend in a lot of places if they don't have them, because we do have those impacts on the system. And then finally, a bill comparison, different usages for our typical single family at 0 to 12,000 gallons per month. And then the same folks on the sewer side, again, a little bit higher. The city is right now today on the sewer side, given the improvements y'all did back in 2012 and after to get up to this level. And then you'll see some of these agencies again may have to do similar improvements. It's kind of this catch-up game, right? Who goes first as you adjust rates, as you go through that process. So to summarize, really here, the rate adjustments are necessary to support the ongoing O&M expenses and inflationary impacts, specifically on the water side to fund that capital improvement needs that were identified in the master plan. On the cost of service side, we did see some differences on the water side, but again, first true cost of service where we looked at customer classes. It's one data point. I don't like making decisions on one data point when we're looking at how customer characteristics can change. So we're recommending those across the board adjustments. And then we've maintained that current rate structure, and only the level of the rate was adjusted to reflect the overall system adjustments. So with that, I will turn it back all over to you if you have any questions on the rates.
Councilman, people, do we have any questions for Shelley?
On the meter size, on the cost of service, in your analysis, you found no change in our cost of service for per meter size?
So that is a really good and challenging question. So at this point, we did not make any adjustments to that. We just increased it by the percentage. So when we think about the meter size, it's how do we recover our fixed, at least a portion of our fixed cost. When we really look in the short term, fixed cost for a water or sewer utility, more on the sewer side, about 80 to 90% of our costs are fixed. So if nobody flushes their toilet or turns on their tap, the vast majority of our costs are going to stay here. So when we think about the fixed charges or that meter charge, then we need to think about what do we include in that. We're at the $10 range right now on just do the sewer side. That's probably right about where the average is if you look at the AWWA water and sewer fixed charge comparison. So you're in an okay spot, but we are collecting more revenue from our volume side than we are our fixed side. So that is an option for you all to think about and look at of what that fixed charge could be, because we can talk about it from a readiness to serve perspective, which means what are those true costs, which would be our customer billing costs. It would be our debt service, right? We have to pay that no matter what happens. And maybe a component of our distribution or collection and conveyance system, because we incur those costs regardless of anybody utilizes it. So, sorry, long answer, but we did not, but we did not make any recommended changes to it. And there's lots of options within that discussion.
I guess my basic question is, do you feel that the service charge reflects a fair charge to the customer,
Yes.
or to that class of customer? Yes.
Yeah, I do, and part of that is, as we start thinking about water and sewer rates, one of the big topics in the industry right now is affordability. And when we start thinking about our water and sewer bill, the customer can't control that fixed charge. And so that $10 for both water and sewer roughly provides a reasonable recovery of the costs. It's kind of in that average range when we look at the rate surveys. And the customer can control, most of the time, their water usage. And that's where we can have that higher charge. So yes, I think it is a fair representation of your costs. Could we change it? Yes, but there's also some disadvantages to that as well.
Another question comes up concerning demand. And you talked about residential demand for water usage, but that same demand is not the same for sewer usage. Sewer usage, I would imagine, is relatively constant for residential as well as industrial. Is that a truism?
There are some differences, and it really depends on the demographics, right? As we start thinking about who's in a home, how many people are in a home, are they home all day, are they at the office all day? Whereas an industry may be discharging continually, or depending on what they're doing, they actually may be holding that and pre-treating that before it comes to the city system. So there are differences. That's why we look at more of the strength component of it. So what are we receiving that we have to treat? The volume side, or that rate of flow, is kind of treated equally for everybody.
For me, my summer water usage goes way high because I water the lawn and I wash the car and I do other good stuff like that, which does not go down the sewer.
Agreed,
And
yep.
I'm concerned that you are charging me for that peak usage that I'm putting on the yard.
Yes.
So, Brent, to answer that question, the city of Columbus, for all residential users, we do a winter consumption for sewer. So we average winter, and that's what you pay in the summertime. You're not paying for those peak usages that you just described.
Thank you very much. I understand, yes. And I'm very careful about what I do in January, February.
I've got a question, not so much on rates, but might be more facilities, and it may be more for staff. We've talked about the need for a new tank, a new holding facility, and then we've even identified a spot on the parkway. Have we talked to the landowner? Or have we just told the landowner that he can up his price because we've now identified where we want to be?
Well, part of that property we already own.
Okay, well, I mean, that's all I'm asking.
If it's gonna meet our footprint or not is questionable.
Gotcha.
There may have to be some additional land.
But it looks to be a nice piece of ground that would make sense, that we're probably in good shape. Okay.
Most anywhere along that 12-inch line would be a good spot, I would think, and
Okay, any other questions? So I guess the question for us is, which way do we want to go as far as the rate increase? Is that correct?
Well, we need to accept the master
Just-
plan, and then we need to accept the rates.
Or make a decision on the rate study.
The recommended
rates wanna
motion
go?
on the rate study does specify which of the water rates the staff is recommending. So in item number 2, there is a recommended motion. That's staff's recommendation. You can obviously
Nine.
take that into consideration, but
I'd recommend the rate adjustment of 3% annually for sewer and 9.5% annually for water over the next 5 years to be approved.
Second?
We have a motion, a second. Any other discussion? Not, go ahead and vote. Looks like we have a consensus. And do we need to do anything with the master plan?
Mr. President, I recommend the water master plan be approved.
Second.
Thank you. Any other discussion? If not, please vote. Very good. We are adjourned. Thank you for your time, gentlemen. Safe travels.
I know everybody can do what they want.